Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. This is Tom Banke with Forward Community Investments, and we're excited to have you join us for today's presentation. Before we get going, I'd like to take this opportunity to share some background on how we got here today. Forward Community Investments is celebrating their 20-year anniversary in 2014. FCI transforms Wisconsin communities by supporting organizations and programs that reduce racial, social, and economic disparities. We have strengthened these communities by offering affordable, flexible loans and expert advisory services that allow organizations to grow sustainably. Our loans, advisory services, and recently added grant funds give FCI the tools to encourage and support initiatives that make positive change possible. Organizations need resources of all kinds, along with the skills and tools to manage them. Technology, volunteers, strong board governance, and financial acumen can provide some answers, but an important first step is to identify your assets and needs, then determine what works best and what can work better. We can help to figure out where you stand and where you want to go. With the help of BMO Harris Bank, we are able to offer this series of webinars to build nonprofit effectiveness. BMO Harris Bank is an active partner in Wisconsin communities and demonstrates strong corporate citizenship as an important part of whom they are and how they approach community. Volunteerism and corporate responsibility are a key part of the culture at BMO Harris Bank. It's how they demonstrate their commitment to and investment in their communities they serve. Well, moving on, first I'd like to do a little housekeeping. And you can join the webinar by using the telephone number provided in your confirmation email that was sent to you from GoToWebinar, or you can use your computer speakers, which is recommended by GoToWebinar. Questions. We want to make this webinar as interactive as possible, and we'll be taking questions throughout the webinar. You can submit them using the chat or questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. We also would like to enact a poll feature, and right now we'd like everybody to participate in that first poll, which is to answer the question that is appearing on your screen now, asking what is your role in your organization? And we'll give some time for everybody to participate in that poll. So it looks like we have just about a little over half of the individuals representing the executive directors and some board members, staff, along those lines. So
wonderful. It's great. It's great to see that we have about 40% of the executive directors, a quarter our board members, and a quarter our staff. And so we're really excited to have you all, as well as the always mysterious other bucket on Excel. So welcome.
Great. And then we'd also like for you to get familiar with the chat feature, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. In that, please enter the name of the organization that you are representing. And we'll give some folks some time to answer that. Great. We've got some folks entering their organization, so it seems to be able to use that for chat. So like I said, we want to keep this webinar as interactive as possible, so if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to send them via the chat feature or the questions feature, and we'll be getting to those as we progress. Now that we've got those tasks out of the way, let's get to know our speaker and about the presentation. Today's presentation will be Designing a Business Model Canvas with Ben Williams. The Business Model Canvas is a tool that helps you describe, design, challenge, invent, and pivot your business model. Your organization's business model can be described with 9 basic building blocks: customer segments and the value propositions for each segment, the channels used to reach them, customer relationships, revenue streams, key resources, key activities, key partners, and cost structure. Ben Williams will introduce the Business Model Canvas for nonprofits and discuss its uses and application, and then we'll demonstrate on how to develop one. As Ben Williams brings a passion for realizing on-the-ground change to his work at FCI, He joined FCI after spending several years as a management consultant working on strategy, marketing, and operations management projects with a focus on organizational growth and change. At this time, I'd like to turn the call over to Ben, who will present today's webinar.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome everyone. I jumped in a little bit earlier just to mention who we had on the line, but I'm really excited to be here today, and this is a topic that I think is a really valuable and relevant one for all organizations that work in the social sector, and I'm really excited to work through this with you today. So as we move forward, we talked a little bit about FCI in our background. I work in our advisory services department, as Tom mentioned. We primarily provide workshops and learning like this online, as well as in-person workshops and one-on-one consultation and advising with clients and collaboratives as they look to move forward and make change. I think this is one particular topic that we're seeing more and more of a trend for, and so I'm going to start the day with just talking a little bit about the environment that we're seeing and that's kind of been leading up to this focus on business models, discuss some common definitions, and then get into the business model canvas, which Tom introduced just a moment ago. The second half of today is really going to be about building that canvas for you, and so I believe Tom sent out an email with a Word document that includes some framing questions and a sample template of a canvas that you can fill in. I'd like this to be a working session, and so as we're moving through each of the sections, I'll give you some time to think of it so that we can leave the day with a full draft of this is our current business model or our sense of an idea, an opportunity, or a partnership that we can move forward. And then I'll move into some next steps. So now that we have a sense of our business model and what it looks like, how do we take that to make changes, move forward, and consider other potential opportunities? Tom mentioned several times that we really want this to be a participative conversation. So as we move forward and go through today's session, please do send questions. I'll have a couple points in time where I'll ask if there's any as we move forward, but don't hesitate to ask them, and we'll save some time at the end just for some check-in. So I'm looking at the environment, and I don't think much of this will be a surprise. The Nonprofit Finance Fund, which is a nationwide CDFI similar to Forward Community Investments, does a survey of over 2,000 or 3,000 nonprofit leaders, and it reports on that each year. And here's a couple trends that we've been seeing, and I think much of this is also reflected in Wisconsin. Most of the respondents noted that there's been an increase in demand for services, and it's been harder and harder to be able to reach that full demand. I think a lot of this is as the recession hits our clients and stakeholders, they need more support, but we also don't have the additional resources in order to provide that to more. And few expect this to be any easier this year than it was in the past. One of the primary goals that the survey really uncovered was that achieving long-term financial stability is a real challenge. And I think part of that is a lack of access to resources, including cash on hand. Over half had less than 3 months. Typically, way back in the 90s, and when the economy was booming, we used 6 months cash on hand as a healthy benchmark for an organization. But as the recession came and has continued to affect a lot of organizations, we typically see 2 to 3 as being a good benchmark now as opposed to more. And this really creates a situation where organizations face a lot more challenges to meet their current obligations, to take chances and try anything new, and that lack of risk tolerance is really something that can keep organizations back. Over 28% ended the year with a deficit, which is always a concern, and very few feel comfortable having open dialogues about how organizations are using their operating needs, and I think that's another area that can change. There has been some promising activities that we've seen in the sector, both nationally and here in Wisconsin, that I think have been increasing more and more, and that's partnering to find ways to reduce those admin costs, and so finding ways to share those costs across organizations or through partnerships has really been going up since 2010. Fewer organizations are using their reserve funds as compared to 2009. I think this is partially a good sign that organizations are maybe able to make some shifts and changes, and partially maybe reflecting that the organizations that did use their reserves fund in the past either don't have those funds available or have since gone out of business. So I think that could be a positive, it could be a negative. one of the things that we've seen more often is now how do we react to this environment and economic climate that we're operating in. And we've seen some really common and positive changes that organizations are really looking to find new ways to make an impact and make change. Over 30% in this survey said that they'd be changing the ways that they're raising and spending money. Over a quarter said that they're going to pursue an earned income venture, so some sort of way to generate income for the organization that can help underwrite those other activities. And 20% will seek funding other than grants and contracts, such as loans and investments, as a way to increase their impact. And so finding new ways to bring in resources to help deliver that value in the community. Some of the other actions that we've been seeing more and more in the community is looking how do we work together. About 50% mentioned that they collaborate with another organization to improve or increase their services. I think this is a real common trend. We all recognize that the problems and challenges that we're trying to work on are bigger than our organization by itself. And so how do we look at those other peers of ours and people in different sectors, whether it be from the government or for-profit sector as well, to find new ways to really make progress. 48% are investing money or time in professional development. This is a really encouraging sign. I think in the for-profit sector, it's a given assumption that developing your people can help you create more value. I think in the nonprofit sector, it's been less common because there's often been a priority to dedicate all resources towards programs as opposed to towards the people that are delivering them. And I think seeing this shift is really an encouraging one as we look at the long-term sustainability of the sector. 40% are looking to increase hardware, software, improving efficiency, and 40% are conducting some long-term strategic or financial planning. We see these as all very positive signs as organizations are looking at where are we going in the future, how can we do that in the most efficient and effective way. At the heart of these, we hear a lot of questions that are really focused around the business model. And just to sum them up into three different kind of buckets. One is, how will our organization increase our impact sustainably moving forward? Sometimes that may mean growing, sometimes that may mean changing or contracting, but how are we going to make that impact and continue to be making that over a long term? What do our stakeholders need to thrive? So the people that we serve, what can we do differently or new or create more value for them in reaching our mission? How can we do things a little bit differently? And lastly, how do we react to change? As funding cycles shift, as priorities in the communities may change, how are we reacting to those? How are we working together differently so that we can really get to some positive improvements and solutions as opposed to just doing things the same way that hasn't always worked in the past? I think all of these at their heart are really around a business model question. And so I want to pose one more poll to the group here around how have you viewed your business model in the past, in 2 years or so. Yes, you have. No, we haven't really, or we're in the process of considering it now. And so I'll give a little bit of time just to see what we have here. All right, thank you for bringing in those responses. I'm seeing about 2/3 have voted so far, and I'll wait just a little bit to see if it changes. About half of the audience has said, yes, we're reviewing that and changing it. Another 40% are considering it, and approximately 8%, so a few, have not really been reviewing it. I think that's really a great sign just to see and know that that consideration is being made. I think a lot of times when we talk about business models, people's sense immediately shifts to the for-profit. How are we making money? What are we doing? And I want to step back a little bit and say this is kind of a general definition of how we look at business models, and it really applies to any sector. It's really the description and rationale for how an organization or partnership or program can create, deliver, and capture value. So how are we creating it? What are we doing and providing to bring value to our users? How do we reach those people, and how do we deliver it? And then how do we capture it? And that capturing in terms of value can be both monetary or mission. I think when we think of value in this sense, again, there's a common sense that we're talking about money, but it's really both the money and the mission impacts. All the value that we're generating using that triple bottom line approach is important to consider. Another common area of confusion is as we look at our plans, Sometimes there are strategic choices that we're making, and that's really the strategy development. That's considering and making options at that high level. Where are we going? And that's really more of a strategy type question. A business model development is really a process of looking at the parameters of what would economically and operationally result in a successful undertaking. So how are we actually going to get there? So if the strategy is our goal and destination, the business model is the route and process of reaching it. And so we're going to be focusing on that business model lens, although this tool can be used to inform discussions at a strategic level as well. So we look at the business plan again, that's testing a proposition. It could be a program, a partnership, a new venture, a growth strategy, or a full organization. And is it economically or operationally viable? So can we make it work, and can we fund it in a sustainable way that can reach that impact? Oftentimes, and traditionally what we've seen with business plans, is that it's stepping back from what we're doing and developing a great drafted document. Typically there's a 4 or 5 page executive summary, 20 to 40 pages of describing all of our impacts, our programs, the market, how we're operating, what relationships we're using, and then the finances and fund development plans to make that happen, how are we going to mitigate risks. And all of this planning steps us outside of the actual doing. And I think this is a great way to elaborate on those assumptions. But oftentimes, if all we're doing is thinking and not actually bring that out to see what are others' reactions to it, we lose that opportunity to test things, grow, learn, and change based on that feedback. And that's really where the value of a business model canvas can come in. And so for those that may be familiar with business model canvases, this was originally developed in 2009 by Dr. Alex Osterwalder, who was studying his PhD and looking at the common frameworks that fit any business models in any sectors. Since then, many other tools have come out. There's the Lean Canvas. There's actually a business model yacht, which I think sounds like a great place to take a vacation. It's also an interesting tool. There's many different approaches, and I'm not going to make a value judgment on which fits. They each have slightly different angles and approaches that they take. We've used several of them and found each of them to be very effective. We're going to be focusing on the original one, the business model canvas, because there's more support available to those resources just as it's been more popular, and it's also, I think, a little bit more applicable to the nonprofit sector than some of the others. And so what the benefit of this canvas approach is that it takes a single page, the canvas, to describe all of the major areas of our business model. So this really streamlines all of the consideration, design, and how we communicate these tools out to others. And so this way we can bring that outside of the boardroom or the organization and get feedback and learn and see what else is there, because there's often in any plan a series of assumptions that we're making about why we think this will work. That's essentially what the business plan is about, developing what we think will work. And so the more clear you can make those assumptions, the easier it is to test them and see if they're viable, if they'll work, or if there's something that we really need to go back to the drawing board and come up with something new. So just as an overview, I'll give one example of kind of a generic business model canvas for a sample organization before we get into our steps. But the business model canvas, and Tom described each of these sections, can really be broken into 9 key areas. So if we start on the far right, there are the stakeholder segments. That's who are we seeking to serve and add value to. In the middle, in the red here, the value proposition, that's what we're offering. So what's the benefit that we're providing to that stakeholder? The channels are the means that we reach those stakeholders, the relationships that we're building with them, and that really frames out the stakeholder side. This is kind of the external side of the canvas. So this is in the community, what's happening, what's being done. From that, you generate outcomes. Those outcomes are both how we're making money and how are we making mission impact. And so it's often referred to as the revenue streams in the for-profit model. If you reword a bit to have the outcomes included, it encompasses those mission impacts. Everything on the left side, that's the infrastructure and plumbing for how we're actually getting everything done. So that's the key activities that it takes to deliver that value, the resources and assets that we need to do so, and the partners that help us get it done. From that, you can really identify what are those key cost structures from those activities and resources, and what are they cost, are they fixed, are they variable, and how does that change as we grow and shift. And that really gives a full picture of everything that we're seeking to do and achieve with our Canvas. And it really provides a concise way of breaking things down into an easy model. So I'll go through a quick illustration, then I'll see if there's any questions before we get into building our own models for our organization. So if we take a sample organization that provides tutoring services to at-risk youth, they saw two key stakeholders. One were the people they were providing services to, and the second were the donors that they were seeking out that helped fund the service. The value proposition, increasing literacy through mentorship. This is how they were seeking to add value. From the at-risk youth perspective, the mentors were able to coach them and build them, and they were able to reach them through community centers. So they went to the community centers and provided their tutoring skills at those locations. They reached donors through typical grant applications. The relationships they built were really as a mentorship partner for those at-risk youth. And through this program, they sought both revenue from those donors and mission impact. Now again, I just want to pause. This is a very, very generalized version just to see how this kind of connects and models through each of the steps. The mission impact we want to get much more specific on, as well as these groups, the conversations, and the channels in more detail. And that's really the front half of that canvas. As we look to the back half, how are they getting it done? The key activities are the tutoring, the grant writing, and getting referrals for the youth into the program. When they looked at the key resources that they needed, sites from the community centers, mentors, and the curriculum for those training were the key areas that they identified as the big picture items that they need. In terms of partners, the school district helped provide curriculum, volunteers did the tutoring and mentorship work, and the community centers, again, were providing those sites. From that, they could generate their cost structure for curriculum, tutor fees, and site rental as they looked at their business model canvas. This is just a really super simple version. Typically, it gets a little bit more complicated than this as we look at an organization, but just to illustrate how this comes together to tell a story about how we're adding value. So now, again, I mentioned that Tom had sent out a file, I think about 30 minutes before we began, that you can use as you move through this. We're going to be working through each of these segments with a little bit more detail and some framing questions around what are we putting in and how are we looking at each of these options. So Tom, do we have any questions from the group? And please, if you have any, submit them through the chat features, and we'll bring them up either now or at the end of the session.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, we did get one question, here we go. Can you offer any advice on how to align strategy development with the business model development? How can we avoid adopting strategy, which is often done at the board level, that is not grounded in a realistic business model?
I think that is a wonderful question, and that is often one of the areas that we see a lot of organizations kind of move into two different spots. And I'll elaborate on a little bit more near the end, but oftentimes strategy development and looking at your budget or your business model happen at two very different times. And if they're not connected and aligned, you're going to be setting goals that your organization is unable to reach. And that automatically creates a situation where you'll feel disappointed. Even if you're making great impact, it'll feel like you haven't reached those goals. And so we typically encourage organizations to look at their business model today and where it's at as a way to inform our strategies and how we move forward. And then reflect, if we're making changes in our strategies, how does that connect and reflect in our business model? And so using tools like this that simplify that business model into a way that's a little bit easier to understand, you can really see what's going on. So if our strategy is to move into a whole new domain of people that we're serving, or a new community, or a new issue area, you can then use the business model of what we're doing today and compare it to what we're doing in the future. I think that's a wonderful issue. Again, I'd follow up and just say that it's really critical for an organization to align their capacities, whether it be their strategic direction, their business model, the talents and skills that they have within the organization and with their partners in order to deliver that impact. And if there are gaps that exist, part of those strategies need to address bridging them. Thank you for that question, and thank you, Tom. So now it's time to roll up your sleeves. Again, if you have that document that we sent out, feel free, you can have it printed out and you can write on it. You can type it in as you go. We try to use a read-writable format with a Word document to help you go through it. We almost always want to start our business model canvas work with who are we serving, because this gives us a sense of what are we looking to have happen. And so when we ask that, the first question is really, who's that primary target for that organization, the program, or collaborative as we go forward? If it's a program that already exists, this should be a relatively easy answer. For a new program or a new venture, it may be a little bit less familiar. The other part is understanding what are the characteristics of an early adopter, or who would be the first people likely to sign up or join or participate in this program. A large part of the work in the business model canvas was informed by design thinking and taking a look through the eyes of those stakeholders. What makes nonprofit business models more unique than most for-profit organizations is the people that are paying for services are often a very different group than those that are actually receiving it. So there might be multiple stakeholder segments. In the example we gave before, there are the at-risk youth that were receiving the services, but they're also the donor bucket that were coming in there. Other times there may be a general community benefit or a neighborhood or a different view as we look at what those segments are. What I would say is even if you have a general category, you want to get very specific about what that segment looks like and how, what's the persona behind that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Just as an illustration, eBay and PayPal, as an example, their first target stakeholder were high-use Beanie Baby traders that were selling and buying Beanie Babies on eBay. That's how PayPal first started. They didn't envision to grow into this very large organization. They started very focused. And the benefit of being really focused on who are we looking to serve is that you can understand their perspective, their opportunities, aspirations, and challenges more clearly. Okay, so if you now have gotten your sense of who's our first stakeholder segment, and again, just be specific and keep it clear. If you have multiple ones listed, as we move through this, maybe consider just one of those as we look at each of these next steps. The second question is the value proposition. So this is what are we providing? So how are we helping out this stakeholder group? This is a fundamental part of how we're adding value. So is it that we're providing services that are increasing their ability to reach their goals? Are we reducing obstacles, barriers, or challenges? And how is that happening? So this is, again, the value. It's not necessarily what we're doing. It's not the activity. That's going to come a little bit later. But it's the value or benefit that we're bringing. These two are the most important parts of the business model canvas. This is kind of the independent variables. As you shift things, everything else will kind of rotate based on your responses to who are we trying to serve and what are we trying to provide. So we're going to give a little bit more focus to that relationship a little bit later with some ways to kind of elaborate on those potential connections and how we understand our clients, stakeholders, and how we look at the way that we can provide value. Okay, let's moving forward to the channels. This is how are we reaching our key stakeholders, and this is going to be both through how we provide the services or how are we communicating with them. There's a marketing tool, and it's an acronym, as all marketing tools seem to be, called ADA-OR. And really the idea is how are we generating attention, how do we reach interest with the stakeholders, how are we developing that desire to make a change, and then finally that action part. So how are we making people aware, getting them interested, wanting them to make a change, and then taking that action. And then once they've done that, how are we bringing them on board, and then how do we retain them? I think that's a useful way as you think about your channels to consider all the different aspects of, from start to finish, how you're engaging with your stakeholders. These can be general, like using websites. It can be through platforms and partners. There are many different ways to look at that. But again, this is where we want to just consider what are those different aspects for how we reach them. I'm moving a little bit quickly, so I'm going to take a little bit of a pause just for a moment before we move into the relationship. So ideally by now we have a sense of who are we seeking to serve, what are we providing, and how are we reaching there. The relationships bucket, sometimes this can seem a little bit vague, but this is really what kind of relationship are we creating? What bonds or connections are we having with this stakeholder? Is it very close and personal? Are you a mentor, a provider, or are you a conduit? Is it an indirect connection where you're just kind of a resource and fluid motion for making that change happen? There's many different ways to look at these relationships. As we consider what we're trying to achieve, this is a good time to bring in those questions of, is that the same view that our client stakeholders have about the relationships that we're seeking to build? Okay. So now that we have that front half of who are we serving, what are we providing, how do we reach them, what's that kind of relationship that we're building with that connection, how is that, what are the resulting mission impacts? So these outcome streams are what comes of this work. So what types of benefits are we providing or creating in the community? And so when we look at this, you know, I think on the mission side, it's important to think, are we building social capital? Are we building skills? Are we creating a community connection, engagement? What are the different types of change that we're seeking? So if you think of your mission statement, that what you're seeking to have, what good you're providing, this should be reflected in the outcomes that we're seeing here for mission impact. The second part, how are we generating revenue? So who's paying for these services? Are the clients paying a part? Is it being underwritten in part by clients and in part by other funders? How is that revenue coming in? Is it through grants? And then, again, as we get into more detail, so you may just have grants as the title here, you'd want to consider what types of grants, how much funding, is it many small grants, several big grants? Again, we want to get specific on what assumptions we're making about how we're generating the revenue for the program. Again, it's a little bit easier to conceive of these for an organization that already exists, but this can be used just as well for those that are new or starting as you think of where do we see those funders potentially coming in. Okay, we are now halfway there, and so I want to take a step back and just take a look at the picture that you've created about what you're offering and who you're seeking to serve, and just see if that feels right. As you talk about what you do, does this represent the who we're serving, what we do as an organization or a program, how we're getting there, the relationships that we build, and then the impact that we expect to see? In some cases, you may have questions already about, well, I'm not sure if this is what it would look like or different. And that is great. That's exactly what this is supposed to do, is make really explicit all of our assumptions for what we're seeking to do so that we can go back and test them and really dig into those ones that we think are of most importance. The next half is really looking on the back end of how are we getting to providing the program. So if the front end is the stage of the theater, the back is everything that's happening behind the scenes to make sure that everything works well. And it begins with what activities we're doing. This is usually a pretty easy one. What are those core activities required for us to deliver that kind of value? What's needed to sustain those operations? And this may be more than just what your organization is doing. You may rely on partners to provide some of those key activities to really deliver the value. And so in the case of that tutoring example, the referrals that are being provided through the school district is a critical activity in order for them to be able to make those connections and deliver their programming. Again, as we look at this, you know, for now, just start thinking of what are those key major things at a high level on what we need. And then typically, as we build out that very specific list of things, you kind of create some summary items as we go through. As you're thinking about these activities, it's sometimes useful to consider what type of work we're really providing. Are we providing services and products? It's a little bit more clear. If what we're doing is providing an infrastructure or a value that's a little bit more general, you know, I think some of the activities made around how do we sustain those operations as opposed to what are we actually delivering. The next one, the key resources and assets that are required. So these are, what are those things that we need in order to deliver our resources? And what are those ones that we really have to have in place in advance in order to provide that? The research that Dr. Osterwalder had conducted mentioned that there were 3 different types of organizations, and this is, I think, true in the for-profit and nonprofit. Either you're providing a product or a service, or you're providing a connection across multiple things, and so more of like a case manager where you take care of all of the needs of a certain segment, or you're providing some sort of infrastructure so that value can be generated for others. And so as you look at those resources, consider what resources are necessary for providing the product, what's necessary for connecting other work, and then what are those core items that we need here. Again, this is the physical assets. It can be virtual computers, software. It's the people. that are delivering those services. It's everything that we need to do in order to make that progress going forward. Again, they may not always be things that we own or do, but what's necessary in the community. Second to last are the key partners and suppliers. These are, you want to list both who are our key partners in providing this program, service, or collaborative, but also what activities or resources are they performing. So indicating which of those previous two buckets they are connected to is really important, so that we make it explicit how they're connecting. I think one confusion that often comes up, and part of it's because often in community development in particular, but in other nonprofit-related organizations, the people that are receiving benefits are also partners in delivering those creations. And so as we think of where would a certain bucket go, stakeholders are really receiving that value. The partners are those that are creating it. And so in general, if you think of who are we seeking to serve in that mission of who we're reaching, that's really the stakeholder side. The partners are everyone that's helping us get it done. So some may be looped onto both, and so you want to think carefully about where do they best fit in the line as we consider our work. And if they're in both, then thinking about how do we use that resource on both ends. Do we treat them differently as a partner than when they're being provided those benefits? That can often be a confusing one. I'm just going to give a little bit more time as people are kind of building out their model. The last item, the cost structure, this is all the costs associated with these activities and resources. So if you look at what are those activities and resources, almost all of them should probably connect to some sort of cost bucket. As you're looking at what those structures are, it's helpful to also consider other opportunities for scale. And so if this is, a facility, the cost for maintaining it, does this mean that there's also an opportunity to grow without having additional costs be incurred? Or is it a variable cost where as we provide more activity and more benefit, the cost is going to increase? And so really getting careful about what types of costs they are is also useful as we look at making potential changes or growing or contracting depending on the context of what you're seeking to do next with your business model. So again, you want to include all those people costs, all those hard fixed costs that we have, any other materials that are critical in providing the services. Again, keeping this at the high level buckets. And so just like that, we've gone for maybe 15 minutes. We should have a general rough draft now of our current business model as a shell. And so Tom, are there any questions? And I'll open it up to the group. As you've gone through this at a pretty fast pace, and again, we do this fast intentionally so that we can look at what are those assumptions we're making and how do we elaborate and tweak and change it. Are there any questions from the audience?
Sure. Yeah, Ben, there was a few questions that came in about if you would be able to go over the tutoring model example again and explaining the relationships and the channels a little bit more.
Great. So I will hop back a few slides. And so as we look at channels and relationships, on the screen here, this is on the right side, items number 3 are the channels. That's how are we reaching those stakeholders? So how directionally are we getting there? And then what kind of relationship are we building as a part of that? Sometimes it can be as an educator or a mentor or a role model. Other times it can be as a provider. In some cases it could be as a conduit. So as you look at those relationships, some of it's how close is that connection with that stakeholder? Is it far away? Are we building their capacity? Are we helping them reach their goals together? How would you describe the relationships that you're creating with each one? There isn't an example here for the donor, but in the donor it may be more of a principal-agent relationship where we receive the grants and then we follow through on those. And so it may be more general like that. I think oftentimes, and I'll go to the instructions as we look at those questions, sometimes it's through peer-to-peer and other partners. that we're creating those channels, but it's every way that we're reaching out to communicate what we're doing to the stakeholders, and then how we're providing services, and what do we do after we provide services? Do we follow up? Do we have activities that do that in a different way? So considering what forms of media do we use, what types of approaches do we connect with others is really key. And again, those relationships are how are we interacting, or how do we want to interact. Sometimes this is where demonstrating the values of an organization can be very important. I'll jump back ahead. Are there any other questions?
We actually do have one more. Sorry, Ben, I don't mean to interrupt you. We did have one more question come through, just asking what is the difference between mission offering and mission impact?
Great question. I think oftentimes they should be pretty closely connected. So I'll give an example. The mission offering, these are often like the programs, and this is the benefit that we're providing. And so if the benefit we're providing in this case is mentorship, the impact may be increased capacity, better reading skills, a sense of community. And so this would be the results. If you think of the business model as a logic model in some ways, the value proposition is really that output. What are we doing? What are we doing there? And then the impact are those outcomes. So what are the short-term outcomes? Is it learning new things? What are the medium-term action outcomes? Are behaviors being changed? What are the long-term outcomes in terms of conditions shifting in the environment? I think there's a tendency, and one of the next steps as we look at this is getting really specific about what we're seeking to have as we look at this so that we make the assumptions really clear. But you can consider, if our program is providing value that's creating community connection and community beautification, for example, some of those outcomes may be secondary ones like a better neighborhood valuation, property values go up, community cost savings if we're an environmental organization and we're providing new tutoring and training. So there's many different layers of outcome streams, but this is where you want to look at kind of what are those things that we have in our logic models, if we have them in place, or in the grants. As we look at goals, this is where we want to be able to measure against those. Okay, I'll move forward a bit just to kind of cover what we do next. And so the first step is just to take a look at our model. Does this make sense? Where are our biggest questions? What could be done differently or better? And then checking in, does the rest of my organization or team understand and agree? One activity that can be useful, this is a really quick, fast, paced development of a business model canvas. At a board meeting, you could have every board member individually go through this exercise to develop what they see as the business model for the organization, and then bring them all together and see where are their similarities, where are their differences, and that can really inform the different assumptions that we each make. I may see the value we're providing and how we're getting it done very differently than someone else. I think after that first flush of, okay, what do we have here, what are we looking at, the second steps are really to get into more detail on how are we providing that value to each stakeholder segment. And that's really the key of how are we generating that benefit in the community, because that's the impact, and that's what we're all here to do, and so focusing on that is critical. A second part is to look outside of the model, at the environment. What are those trends, market forces, other parties that exist that could be influencing what we're doing or maybe shifting how we look at the future? Highlighting your biggest assumptions. In some cases, it might be what do we think is the most risky? What am I the least sure about? Oftentimes, this can be the connection between what we're offering and what the stakeholders are asking for or seeking. Will they find this something valuable? Will they take it on? We may think that once they do, it'll be great, but how we get them involved? So where are those assumptions or risks that we see? This can really highlight those and make it bare, because everything is on one page. It's much harder to hide those assumptions in a model that's very clear and rather simple like this, as opposed to a business plan where it can kind of get sunk into those details. And then taking them out and getting feedback. Other people in the organization, people outside the organization, does this make sense? As we move forward, testing some of those assumptions. So if we talk to customers and stakeholders and say, this is what we see as some of the obstacles in your way, and here's some ideas on what we can do, that can be an important way to look at it. Again, I just want to highlight that connection between the stakeholder segments and the value proposition is one of the most important things to work on and make sure is really clear, especially for new ventures where we're not certain what the impact could be. This is probably the most important assumptions to clarify. So when we look at it from the stakeholder perspective, what are their goals and activities? What would help them achieve them or overcome those barriers? The value proposition side, those are the services and activities, and how are they adding value or reducing disparities and obstacles? The authors of the Business Model Canvas, Dr. Alex Osterwalder and Ives Pajur, I believe, created a second book that just came out a week or two ago, and it's really focusing on that value proposition in more detail. And it's a second, similar to one-page thing where we look at, on the right side here, what are the jobs or tasks, what is the stakeholder seeking to do? What are their expected benefits, desires, or positive surprises that they would like to see in a product? What are their challenges or obstacles? And so if we took that mentoring example, it could be completing homework, receiving good grades, getting through things done, having more time. Those are the jobs and tasks. What are those gains, benefits that they're expecting? And what are the obstacles that are in their way? Is it a lack of access to resources, lack of role models? So outlining clearly what we see from the customer's perspective, the client's perspective, and then connecting that to what are we offering and how is that creating those benefits or reducing those pains is what's on the left side. And that's really what would go in to the value proposition slide. So if you kind of took those client segments, stakeholder segments, and the value proposition part, this would be the fill in on those ones. And then you won't always have every single service that you offer fit every single need or gain. There's often going to be many more things that the clients or stakeholders would like and many options for things that you can do, but picking out what are those key ones that we're focusing in and why is important. And so as we look at that, there's some other tools that you can use around creating an empathy map, which is really where we take the perspective of our stakeholder and say, what do they think and feel, what do they see, what are they hearing, what are their influences, and then how are they acting? And this is kind of a way that we can kind of make our assumptions about who we're serving very clear. And that can really elaborate on what are the pains and obstacles that they're facing and what are the gains that they're seeking. And you can test this. There's tons of research that says asking a customer what they want will lead to misleading results. I think there's a great quote from Henry Ford that's, if I asked my customers what they want, they would have said they want a faster horse. And so you have to use some other tools to understand the client's perspective as a whole and then make some assumptions on how do we add value to that. And these types of tools, like the empathy map and the value proposition design, can really help with that. That second step of looking outside the business model, there's always many forces outside of us that are sometimes in our control, sometimes not, that we want to consider. So what are those key trends, whether they be regulations, social or cultural norms, technology that may be impacting the work that we're doing? Some of those that we indicated before around challenges in the economy might fit. What's happening for our stakeholder clients? Is the landscape changing? Are their needs and demands shifting? Are there issues that are coming up? Are there costs associated with making changes that we could help alleviate? Those macroeconomic forces, those are the bigger picture. What's going on in the regional economy? What's the supplies and economic infrastructure available to provide our services? The industry side is kind of what's all happening for our partners and stakeholders, competitors that might be in the market. Are there substitutes that could provide the service as well? And so looking at that outside environment can provide the context for our business model as we look at what to do next. And so I think one of the first reactions that many people that we've presented this to have said, this is really a simple tool. And I think that's part of the intent, is to really make things very easy and digestible. This isn't a replacement for business plans where you go into depth to really test those assumptions and get into more detail. But as a start, this is a great way to bring that conversation and your assumptions clear. And starting with assessing and adjusting your current business model is one way that we've used this with organizations and clients. Considering new investments. So if we're going to change some of those resources or assets that we have in our organization, what's the impact going to be? How is that going to relate to other things? By having everything clearly laid out with the assumptions of how they connect, we can kind of make some choices there. Is it worth investing in a new database and infrastructure, or is it worth partnering with someone else to provide those backroom services to us? Considering new ventures, oftentimes the biggest challenge for organizations is how do we overcome the risk of not being sure if something's going to work? And this is a great way to quickly move through some of those first idea thoughts and get into testing what could be different, what can look at it, and create a set of assumptions that we can test in the community before we start acting and before we spend hours and hours creating those plans and writing those grants. Lastly, using this for partnerships is something that we found to be very valuable. If you take a look at what the business model of each partner is and how they create value, and then look at how do we work together on potentially a new venture, or how do we align our services in a different way, you can learn quite a bit. Other ways that we look at it in terms of assessing and adjusting a current business model might be saying if we have a set of 3 or 4 different programs, creating a canvas for each one, and then looking at how they all fit together. Do they fit seamlessly and we all are serving the same client stakeholders? Or do they fit in a different way where each of us are providing a different slice of the pie and there isn't as much overlap? This can be a great way to look at how all of our programs fit, and then how we make changes on that strategic lens can be a really valuable part. For more information, we'll send a couple more details. The Business Model Canvas and Other Tools has a new website, I think, as they released their new book called strategizer.com. It's kind of a silly name. They have some wonderful tools available, though, and their blog provides a lot more detail on how to use the different aspects of the canvas to make questions to seek focus on and keeping those assumptions clear. Lean Impact is a great site. A lot of these tools come from a trend around process improvement and lean Toyota-type Six Sigma management. The Lean Impact site is a compilation of social sector-oriented change, and they have a lot of great resources and illustrations of organizations that have used this well. There's also an online course through Acumen, which is, I think, a no-cost, massively online and open course that you can take called Lean for Social Change, which provides great resources and tools as we move forward. Got about 5 minutes or so left, and so I'd love to hear if there are any questions, either for next steps or as we move forward. And so if they have any, please feel free to submit them and we take a look at it. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you've created a business model and you want some feedback or you have questions in specific that you'd like to take offline, don't hesitate to send an email. We love to hear how people are using these tools and what we'll be doing. We'll provide these slides as a follow-up again and examples. I think, again, the great benefit of using this is the more that we break things down and simplify them, the easier it is to have conversations and dialogues to really get into detail on what those assumptions are, and that can be where a lot of value comes in. So as I'm looking through the questions, the one thing that I'm seeing that's coming up is how would I use this if I do have those multiple programs? Would I start with the organization or would I start with the programs? And I think that's one of those, you could do it either way. I find it easier to start at the more granular level, and so start with a single program the same way that you would if you were creating logic models, and then take each of those programs, which may have a little bit more detail in each canvas, and then kind of adding them up and seeing where's their overlap, where's their not overlap, and then you can kind of create a more summary level set of a canvas that can kind of communicate how your organization goes. Oftentimes this is a great place to see if there are gaps, to come up with new ideas and innovations that we could do differently, or realizing that we have resources that we could be using better across our organization.
We do have one question that just came through as you were answering that question, Ben. So this canvas, is this something that could be a framework for a board retreat or like a task force for the board? Do you have any feedback on something like that? Like how could you use this?
I think that would be a great way to use it. You know, I think even just at a board meeting, presenting it, there's a 2-minute video that we can share. It has a weird music soundtrack, which I find really distracting and bothersome, but it just illustrates the canvas very quickly, faster than I've done over the course of this webinar. And then you can just have breakout conversations in groups as we develop them, and you know, doing them either as a full group together or one-on-one and then looking at where we had different ideas. There's a lot of resources on the Strategizer tool about how do we apply this moving forward, but I find it easiest to have post-it notes because you can easily change, move, and keep things shifting around as we look at it, and you can draw these up on flip charts or whiteboards. There's also printable copies that you can get of a 3x5 foot one if you want to really commit and have something that large, but I think you can also just print these off on like 11x17, and that can be useful.
And the video that Ben alluded to, that will be available, it is available on our website, and we'll be sending a follow-up message that will include that as well. So,
great, thank you. And if you're gnawing at the bit and want to do this in 5 minutes from now, you can Google Business Model Canvas Introduction into YouTube, and there's a quick 2-minute link to it from the authors of the site.
Okay. Well, just please join me in thanking Ben for today's content and BMO Harris Bank for their support. The presentation that he shared was so valuable, as with all of our webinars. We did record it, and it will be available for playback from our website. We'll be sending up a follow-up message, as I mentioned, to all attendees with links to more resources from the presentation, the aforementioned link to the recording of the presentation, as well as the slides that Ben went through today. I would encourage all participants to review our website at forwardci.org for more information on how FCI might be able to help your organization. Our next installment of the 2014 Virtual Leadership Series will be Advocacy for Nonprofits with John Keckhaver of the Wisconsin Nonprofits Association, and that will take place on Thursday, December 18th at 12 p.m. You can register for this webinar and find more information about it on our website. This information will also be included in that follow-up message. One last note, when you close your browser from today's session, you will be directed to a very concise questionnaire to evaluate today's webinar. Please take a few minutes to complete to help us continue to improve the effectiveness of these offerings. Thanks again to BMO Harris Bank for making this exceptional learning opportunity possible. Take care and enjoy the remainder of your day.
Thank you all, and have a wonderful afternoon.